projector says it's warming up, so I'm going to give it another minute and do our refresh while it thinks about what it's going to do. But welcome to our last class on Chapter 1. We're probably going to finish off just a little bit early today, and that I think is very good for a Friday before a long weekend. So at the end of last class, we had been talking about behaviorism and then transferred over into radical behaviorism. And behaviorism was that idea that our environment is controlling our behavior. Things that are in our environment influence how we behave based on what we learn from interacting with that environment. Again. And then radical behaviorism was the idea that not only are we not considering the mind as part of this process, we don't think that the mind is even remotely relevant for this process. So B.F. Skinner was our radical behaviorist who said that even if you could understand exactly what was going on in someone's head, it would never help you understand and predict their behavior. So that was a pretty dramatic swing there. I seem to, every time, have a fight with this projector. Oh, good. So it's not just me.
No, it's happening all over the school. The light is just orange.
So I had it orange and flashing, and then that stopped, and I pushed it, and it went green, which it's supposed to do. And I was like, okay, I'll leave it. We'll give it the intro. And then it was like, no, still not going to work. It's green now? Oh, good. Third time's the charm. Oh, my goodness. Yeah, just what everyone wants at the beginning of their lecture. Let's do some IT problem solving. Come on, boot up. Oh, that sounds promising. Okay. All right. Good. I did not want to end Friday with fighting with our projector, so that sounds like it's actually booting up. So I'm going to start talking about our slide with the cognitive revolution. So if you're following on, there it is. Awesome. Okay. Good. Now I know we have to deal with that every week, but cool. So in the same vein as what we've been talking about previously, where we'd mention one perspective or one school of thought, and then almost immediately we have a contrasting school or idea come up against it, we're going to do that again. So we had our behaviorists, where the mind is irrelevant and we're focusing on environmental influences, and now our contrast is this cognitive revolution, where we start focusing on the mind as being more important in determining our behavior. So first off, we're going to talk about a little bit of a middle ground. And this is actually where my own interests lie. So I would classify as a cognitive behaviorist, which is a little bit of a mixture between behaviorism, where when we do things like operant conditioning in the lab, we're focusing on environmental influences, teaching you something about that environment, but by adding that cognitive piece in, we are taking into account the role that the mind plays. So a cognitive behaviorist then would say, look at learning experiences and the environment and see how they affect our behavior, specifically by giving us information to make decisions, to behave effectively. So what we learn from interacting with our environment is still really critical to cognitive behaviorists, but it's not that it's directly affecting our behavior. We're saying that the mind is involved somehow, taking that information and then making a decision about how we behave. So there's some cognitive involvement. And our name for cognitive behaviorism is Albert Bandura. And I specifically mention him because he was born in Alberta. And so he was focused in on how our environment and our experience with our environment affects our thoughts, and how our thoughts in turn affect our behavior. And so this is a fairly influential field even to this day, as you might have figured since you've now met a cognitive behaviorist. But continuing on with this cognitive revolution, this was, as I said, a direct contrast to that strict behaviorist perspective. And this started happening in the 1950s. So people started focusing again on the importance of our mental states and internal processes. So if you remember, before we were talking about behaviorism, we were talking about our structuralism versus functionalism. And those were entirely focused on either the structure of the mind or the function of the mind. And then we had our swing in the opposite direction to care only about the environment with behaviorism. And now we're swinging back with cognitive psychology, where we're focusing again on the importance of the mind and those internal mental states and processes. And this was an interesting time because it corresponded also with the rise of computers. So they weren't necessarily commonplace at this time, but they were coming into sort of more popular use, at least at the research level. And so a lot of the terminology that we see in cognitive psychology actually directly overlaps with computers. So they think of humans as information processors. We talk about storing away memories. So when we start getting into the chapter on memory, we'll talk about putting things into long-term storage or retrieving memories out of long-term storage and working with it actively. So a lot of our terminology and a lot of our models used to explain sort of our memory and how our mind processes information actively came out of this cognitive revolution and was strongly influenced by computer models. Another interesting part about this is that it was strongly driven by the Second World War. And that's because they had large numbers of people who were being put into situations where they needed to think quickly and use things that they might not have had the best training on. So the specific example we have here is an airplane cockpit. And there's all these dials and gauges and everything there. And the application that we had was, okay, if somebody has only been trained on piloting for a couple of weeks, these dials and gauges need to be somewhere intuitive. How do people process information? How do we view things? How do we interpret things in our environment so that we can put these in the most logical and constructive location? So there was a massive interest in our cognitive processes, in what we're doing and how we're thinking about things so that we could make stuff more efficient. All right, and so from there, actually kind of in the background, not so much in contrast to behaviorism or cognitive psychology, we're actually going to sort of sidestep into the psychodynamic perspective. If you look at it on a timeline, this happened at the same time as both behaviorism and cognitive psychology, but we talk about it separately because they kind of kept to themselves. And so the psychodynamic perspective, every time you see the word psychodynamic or psychoanalytic, you are going to think of Freud. That is how this course is going to set you up. It's going to become sort of a Pavlovian response, because every time we say psychodynamic or psychoanalytic, we are going to be referring back to Freud. So this perspective is important because it was the first major movement in clinical psychology in modern history. So this is when we were focusing in on the clinical aspect. So when we're looking at behavioral psychology or cognitive psychology, that isn't specific to humans. It isn't just looking at psychological disorders or treating psychological disorders or anything like that. But the psychodynamic perspective is where we're starting to zero in on humans as unique subjects. So you'll find that a lot of the concepts for psychodynamic perspective, as well as when we get into sort of positive psychology and humanistic psychology, then we're caring more about humans directly. And the main focus, the defining factor of this perspective, is that they were focusing on the influence of the unconscious mind on our behavior. So if you've heard of Freud, you kind of already have that association with the unconscious. Freud was obsessed with buried memories and urges that you are unaware So our unconscious would be thoughts, memories, and desires that exist below the surface of our conscious awareness. And he figured that they would exert great influence on our behavior, but that we wouldn't realize that they were happening. So his goal was to get at those hidden thoughts and feelings and figure out how they were influencing people's behavior. Needless to say, this was fairly controversial at the time and has only gotten more so controversial as time has gone on. So I always give a little bit of a disclaimer when talking about Sigmund Freud, and that's because even though most of his theories, most of his proposed ideas are nowhere near what we use today, we talk about him a lot because I guess the best way to say it is that his ideas were so controversial that he made enough people mad that they came up with other theories that better explained the concepts. So Freud was the first person that really pushed people to care enough to come up with alternatives. And so that's why we talk about him, and that's why he's so important, because he had ideas about so many different aspects of psychology, and his strange concepts led other people to propose other things that were a little bit closer to the truth. So a lot of what we talk about with Freud sounds a little bit ridiculous and incredulous, and most of his compatriots ended up thinking the same and putting forward new ideas that are what we use today. So the psychodynamic perspective, while it always starts with Freud, that's not where it ends. So that's my little disclaimer about Freud, because he is a very, very controversial figure. But he was an Austrian physician, and he focused on this psychodynamic perspective by going in on this psychoanalytic school of thought. So he was trying to look at things like free association and dream analysis. That's that vision that you might have of a psychologist as someone sitting in a room in a big armchair, and they have someone on a couch trying to remember forgotten childhood memories. That's the kind of thing that Freud did with this psychodynamic perspective. And by asking people to try and remember things that had been long hidden, he was trying to get at that unconscious, those deeper levels of things that might be driving your behavior now. So, very controversial notions. Yep. He was mostly clinical, but he was doing stuff interacting with people and using his practice to then inform his theories. So he was kind of doing both, where he was like adjusting and collecting data as he interacted with people, but he was also trying to treat and help people as he went. So even though a lot of his stuff ended up causing more harm than good, the intent was to fix them. This, when we get into it, we get into a lot of it, but it led to a lot of things like memories, quote-unquote memories, of childhood trauma that never happened. It led to a lot of sort of future trauma because they thought things had happened. So he did a lot of things, and because this was happening sort of late 1800s, early 1900s, there was no governing body that said that this wasn't okay. So there's a lot of stuff that went on, and it has now informed a lot of what we know about how the mind works, but it wasn't done in the best way. So yeah, that's why always the disclaimer with Freud. So he had some interesting perspectives and significantly influenced the field. Yep.
So you said that it was like controversial because of people were thinking that they have like trauma, not trauma, they have trauma and stuff. Like, how can you unlock something that's like not there? Like, was it just like
We get into this a lot more in the memory chapter, but it's really cool, so we can talk about it a bit now. Basically, when you're accessing memories, it's not like watching a DVD or something. It's not like it's hard written into your brain. When you access that memory, it's like you pull it out of storage and manipulate it in your working memory. So when you're using those memories, you can have an effect on them. So when he was having people think back to a previous time, they were accessing memories, and then he'd say things like, whoa, well, you remember experiencing this, right? And because people were in a very relaxed state and he was an authority figure, they'd be like, yeah, okay, maybe a little bit. And then the next time they pull that memory out, it's a little bit stronger. Like, yeah, I definitely remember that. And before they knew it, they're like, no, I was definitely in this awful situation, and now I'm reacting to it. So the memories that we have aren't as concrete and rigid as we'd like to think, and they're very easily manipulated and influenced. It causes a lot of problems in things like police questioning. So questioning a witness is not as reliable as we might be led to believe from, say, procedural police shows. Because by asking misleading questions, you can change what people remember. And the hardest part is that they don't realize they're being shifted, and they think that it's exactly what they remembered, which is really cool and scary at the same time. So yeah, we'll talk far more about that in the whole chapter on memory, but we look at things like inattentive blindness, where you don't notice things because you're focused on something else. Also, biases when we try and remember things, and it's easier to remember some things but not others. And even just talking to people can change your memories. So it's very, very cool. And most of what we know started with Freud and his strange ideas. Yeah, so that's a whole tangent there. But as I said, it's really interesting, so I always like talking about that. All right, so for our next big school of thought, we can start talking about humanism and positive psychology. And these ones get lumped together because, like our Freudian psychodynamic perspective, the focus is on humans, but this one did specifically arise in contrast to the psychodynamic perspective. So, from my brief description of how Freud operated, we're focusing on a lot of sort of deep, dark, repressed things and hidden urges, and everything is fairly negative. And so the contrasting field that arises, humanism and positive psychology as sort of two related fields, they wanted to still look at humans, but they didn't want to do it from a negative perspective. They wanted to focus on the positive, hence the name. So this was a direct reaction to Freud's pessimistic view of human nature, and they also really disliked behaviorism's perspective of behavior as reactions to the environment. They really wanted to double down on free will and individual choice, as well as trying to strive to improve yourself. So they focused on those positive aspects of human condition and our capacity to change and grow in time. So again, we'll get more into each of these when we get into the specific chapters on it. But our big thing here is emphasizing free will, so humans choose what they want to do, and most of their choices would be motivated by this striving to achieve your individual potential. Basically, that all people at some level want to be the best person that they can be. And so for our names here, we'll talk about both Maslow and Rogers. And Maslow is one of those that you might actually have heard of without realizing you've heard of him. But Maslow is famous for Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So it's usually a triangle drawn on a paper, and at the bottom you have your most basic biological needs, things like food and water. And then the next step up are things that are sort of less basic but still important to exist and live a full life. So things like safety and security. And as you move up this hierarchy, you get more and more abstract in these things that he thinks of as critical to becoming an ideal self. So we get all the way up to the very end with self-actualization, which is achieving sort of your ideal self. So it's a very interesting and difficult concept for me to relate to, mostly because of the behaviorist background that I follow. But it does work with a lot of human-specific topics, and we'll get into that later on in the course. We also have Carl Rogers, who instead of talking in sort of more broad terms about self-actualization and reaching your individual potential, he was focused on the therapy aspect, and specifically person-centered therapy. So he wanted to sit down with clients and listen to them and give them support, positive interactions, rather than actually guiding them or forcing them to remember things that may or may not have happened. So he was big on getting people to feel sort of empowered and comfortable with themselves, as opposed to giving them orders or directing them to do something specifically. And so we'll talk quite a bit more about these two as we go on in the course. All right. So I do take a little bit of a pause here to talk about psychology specifically in Canada. As I mentioned, we have sort of biases in how we look at information. So I try and bring in a little bit of Canadian, trivia more so than anything. These dates are more for interest's sake. As I said, I don't like testing dates. So we have that first experimental lab set up at the University of Toronto. So that was set up by James Mark Baldwin. And Baldwin was an important figure because he stuck around and then helped found the American Psychological Association. So if you've ever had to write a paper in APA format, that is the association responsible. So APA, we view it as just a format for how you order your references or how you put together an essay or something like that. But if you've ever looked at their site and gone searching, there's so much more to it than that. They have guidelines and procedures and protocols for pretty much any aspect of psychology that you can think of. So this is a way that we structure psychology and try and keep the system itself as something very scientific and governed by rules, as opposed to the chaos that existed before they were established. So the American Psychological Association and other such boards are what help sort of guide ethics and things like that in research. And more than 40 years later, the Canadian equivalent, the Canadian Psychological Association, was founded, and for the most part, the Canadian Psychological Association is the same as the American version, but just geared towards Canadian research. So it would have more oversight within Canada, but operates on very similar principles. And for a couple of famous Canadian names that, again, we'll touch on more when we get into the chapters where they're relevant. So we have really important contributions from Brenda Milner, whose name you might know if you've ever heard of HM. It's a famous case study of somebody who lost his ability to form long-term memories. And Dr. Milner spent decades with this individual, understanding what he could and couldn't remember and how that might be stored. So we'll talk about some of the really cool experiments that she tried with him that helped us realize that there's a very different way that we store things like procedural memory, so say remembering how to ride a bike, versus sort of knowledge or empirical memories, things like knowing the capital of Canada. So HM could remember physical things like riding a bike or tracing a figure on a page, but he couldn't learn things that he had experienced. So it was a very neat division there. And then also Donald Hebb was a very important figure when it comes to neural networks and how we might theoretically store our memories. And the idea there very basically is that as we use different neural pathways, those pathways form stronger and stronger associations. So as we use those areas more and more, it becomes easier to use them and the memories stay better. And again, we'll do way more of that in the memory chapter. All right, and so I've kind of laid the seeds for this next topic where we start talking about culture and diversity in psychology. And that's because at the very beginning, I kind of reminded you that psychology tends to focus on where it is. So as North American psychologists, we know a lot about North American psychologists. And this is actually fairly problematic because with psychology, a lot of conclusions are trying to be drawn to humankind as a whole. But if you're only studying one particular group, that's not a great way to expand that info. So we can think about the term ethnocentrism, which is viewing one's own group as the standard for judging. So this happens fairly commonly in psychology. It was a lot worse in the past, and they're starting to reform and starting to make improvements and being aware of the issues, but it is still something that needs to be considered. So historically, we had middle, upper class white males studying other middle and upper class white males. What usually happened was that psychology researchers would be working at universities, and their study subjects would be students who were coming to universities. And when psychology was first established, almost all students at universities were middle and upper class white males. So the conclusions that they were drawing only applied to other middle and upper class white males, even though they were trying to make conclusions about humans in general. As time goes on, people started to realize that this was problematic and are starting to make sort of an active effort to not just look at one particular group. And so in the 1980s in particular, and more so as time has gone on, we started to see more interest in how cultural factors might influence behavior. So instead of just focusing on Western cultures, what about the rest of the world? What about the other majority of the population? And as time's gone on, we've actually had it become easier to start collecting data in other places. So this growing global interdependence, things like the internet and transit, things have gotten a lot easier where you can go places or collect information in other places. And then your subject group doesn't have to just be the people at a university. And so this is leading to increased cultural diversity, but we should always be aware of things like our population of interest, who we're trying to make claims about, as well as our subject pool. Who are we actually studying? And we'll talk about that quite a bit in the next chapter because as you start reading scientific articles critically, you start noticing that our subject pools don't necessarily match what authors try and make claims about. So that's a good thing to watch for. And that leads us nicely into the idea of intersectionality and culture, where you can start thinking of, okay, well, maybe we don't want just middle and upper class white men. What if we want to introduce women? What if we want to introduce people from other countries, people from other backgrounds, religions? All of these other things must be taken into account. And that's where intersectionality comes into play. We're saying that individuals don't necessarily belong to just one group. You have to consider that they can be influenced by belonging to multiple groups. And their different group identities can have different influences on their behavior. So we have to keep that in mind when we're doing research and interpreting the results of research. So each person can have those multiple identities, they can belong to multiple groups, and that will change their behavior in different ways. All right, so I take a brief pause here because this is something that I find interesting and potentially helpful as you guys are theoretically interested in psychology and might want to do something within the field. I will caveat this with, I won't ask you questions about this. These are just some of the major research areas that we see in modern psychology. I show you guys this because you're starting in intro psych. These are the places that you can start looking into. These are the other classes you can start taking, the fields you can be interested in. But with my perspective of only testing sort of applicable skills, I don't really need you to remember that developmental psychology it makes up about 18% of psychology studies. I just find it interesting to note that things like, say, developmental and social psychology are a large portion of what people study or research in psychology. So there's a lot of care about developmental, so how do our decisions, how do our behaviors, how does our mind change as we go from infancy to childhood to adolescence and more. There's a lot of really interesting research looking at how our cognitive capacity changes as we get older and different ways that we can maybe protect our brains and how we think even as we get into old age. For social psychology, we can look at human interactions. How does being in school versus learning from home, how does that change our learning process? There's all sorts of different things we can look at there. If we want to focus on school specifically, a little bit of overlap with social, we can look at educational psychology. So what's the best way to teach? What's the best way to learn? Health psychology. We have behavioral neuroscience, experimental psychology, and more. So each of these have a pretty big standing. And they've each got sort of different areas of expertise. And a lot of these are going to sort of overlap nicely with chapters that we cover in this class. And then if you end up taking 105 as well, that class will cover sort of the remainder. But each chapter tends to be sort of a different area of psychology that you might study. And in terms of professions, so instead of just research, when we look at professions, most psychologists do line up with the preconceived notion of clinical psychologists. 72% of practicing psychologists are clinical psychologists. And if they're not clinical psychologists, they're into counseling psychology. So maybe working as a guidance counselor or something not, say, prescribing or directly treating, but maybe offering advice. An interesting one that I learned about fairly recently was industrial organizational psychology. And that's an individual who would go into, say, a business and tell them the best way to interact with their employees, or how do you reduce interpersonal conflict, or things like that. What kind of environment makes people work best? So there's a couple of different options on the professional side of things outside of research. And so that brings us into our slow wrap-up of this chapter. And so we've talked about lots of different perspectives, lots of different points of view, and I find there's usually someone every year who asks me, well, you've told me all these different perspectives, which one is the right one? Which is the one that we should be using? And the answer is there isn't a right perspective. Hopefully you've kind of gotten that vibe by now that each different perspective offers a different point of view. And sometimes you want to approach the problem from different angles. So as a cognitive behaviorist, I would approach, say, chickadee learning with a little bit of cognition and the environmental focus. But maybe we have somebody come in who's a neuroscientist. They want to look at the neural side of things, and they specifically want to look at what's going on with the neurons in the brain. Conveniently, I work with a neuroscientist who does that sort of stuff for me. So having different perspectives can really help. You might find that certain situations, certain problems that you're trying to solve line up better with different perspectives. It's fairly, I'm not going to say impossible, but pretty close to try and apply, say, the psychodynamic perspective to non-human animals. That just doesn't really work. But there are situations where you can use multiple perspectives to approach the same problem. So a lot of these perspectives interact and they can combine and work together. And the big take home there is that psychology is complex and there's lots of these different factors to consider. I use that as a transition to talk about some of the challenges in psychology. And these are things that I want you to kind of keep in the back of your mind, especially as we work through the next chapter, where we talk about actually conducting research. What is the scientific method and populations and experiments and things like that. So these are things that you want to keep in mind as we start looking at it critically. So the first big thing is kind of an obvious one. Behavior is really hard to predict. With all of these alternative factors going on with past experience and environmental influences and all this stuff happening, it is really hard to accurately predict behavior. And as psychologists, a lot of what we're trying to do is predict behavior. And we might be in the right ballpark, but I would never assume that we're going to be right 100% of the time, even if you've done really good research. The best we can do is give an educated guess. We also want to consider that our psychological influences rarely occur in isolation. There is almost always multiple factors at play. And when we start talking about conducting research, we'll talk about things like confounding variables, where other factors might be driving the behavior that we're looking at without us even realizing it. And so as you gain more experience, you realize that it's never as simple as we might hope. So when we make claims like, this thing causes that thing to happen, you should start having little alarm bells in your head that say, always, or only in certain scenarios, or only when certain other conditions are present. We also want to keep in mind that people are unique, and not even just people, but if you're studying any animal, there are individual differences, individual experiences, individual body states. All of these things can affect the behavior that you observe. That feeds back into the behavior is hard to predict. We find with some of our chickadees, when we're looking at how quickly they learn tasks, we'd have notes on their cards, and sometimes you're like, this guy's a little slow. He's really food motivated, but he's not that bright. And that is an individual difference that we would just have to account for. Sometimes that's how you end up with outliers in your data. With people specifically, well, and I guess it does apply to other animals as well, there are social factors that influence behavior. The problematic part with people is, as researchers, we are people too. So if I walk into a room and interview someone, just me being there and asking those questions can influence the answer that they give. So people might bend the truth a little bit to try and give an answer that makes them look better. Or maybe they're going to avoid telling you something that makes them look bad. Sometimes people will give you the answer that they think you're looking for. So they'll give you an answer that lines up with what they think the study is looking for. Or sometimes people want to be jerks and they'll give you the opposite answer. But the problem with all of that is that they're not answering honestly, and therefore the data we're collecting from them isn't helpful. So we have to keep in mind that there are all of these influences by just being around people. And even if you can keep yourself as the researcher hidden so that they don't know they're being observed, people being in the room with other people changes their reactions. Just an aside, there's studies like having people wait in a room, and if they wait alone and there's smoke coming in under the door, they'll immediately panic and try and evacuate. But if they're in a room with, say, 3 or 4 other people, and those people are part of the experiment and they intentionally don't react to the smoke, the participant won't react because no one else is reacting. And they'll sit in the room much longer than they would if they were alone. So these social factors can have massive influence on our behavior. And again, we need to keep it in mind. Yep.
Is there, like, that's interesting to me about how, like, there's so many factors that go into things here. Is there any way to know that any experience you've ever done or after, in the sense that there's so many things that could do that?
Yes and no. So I have a strong interest in statistics. I teach some other side classes on statistics, and there are really complex statistical methods that you can use to try and pull out other factors that might be biasing your data across multiple things. The thing that I find most limiting in psychology is actually our sample size, because it's really hard to get people willing to participate. And so as you have less participants, you get less statistical power, and then you have less certainty in your results. So for the most time, that's why we can't say that we've proven something. We can say that we have evidence that supports this, but we don't think we have the whole picture. So we kind of get as close as we can and hope for the best. which is a really depressing way to look at it. I know, and that killed me, coming into this and starting to see that we don't necessarily know the answer. And most of the answers that we have is, well, it's kind of this and kind of this, but not either. And that's exhausting, but you kind of start changing your way of looking at it to accept that that's okay. It caused a little bit of a crisis of faith for me in science because I thought that there was a right answer for everything. But now I'm kind of looking at it more as it's cool then that we get to be part of finding out. So maybe that's a little bit less of a depressing perspective. Yeah.
Just about something.
Mm-hmm.
There was real life examples too, that restaurants, when restaurant partner to leaving, see the restaurant because they want to be built. So it's a real life example of smoking movement. So that was not exactly a study done yet.
Yeah. It's really interesting how many times we start seeing like real life scenarios where it's like, ooh, we only thought about it theoretically, but it actually happens. There's some interesting ones looking at the bystander effect, because that was mostly theory, but then you start actually seeing cases where it happens, where people assume that someone else is going to take care of it, and then nobody does anything. We do have to be careful because the science, like the experiments, tend to be a little bit more, I guess they're more powerful because they're strongly controlled. So we see it as a massive effect because we've controlled lots of extra variables, and then in real life it's more complicated, but it still exists, at least to some point. So lots of stuff that we have to consider. And then the last point is going back to behavior being shaped by culture. Culture and experience, what you're used to, what you've been surrounded by, can change your perspectives. I use the example of getting into an elevator. As a child, you don't necessarily know that there is a right or wrong way to stand in an elevator. But if you get in an elevator and face the back wall, very quickly you learn from the fact that no one else is doing that, and everyone is looking at you strangely, that you're probably doing it wrong. So those experiences, being surrounded by others who have these ideas of cultural norms, that influences what you yourself think is normal, and therefore how you will behave accordingly. So those are lots of things to consider. And that brings us into our last slide for this chapter, which are our major themes in psychology. And all of these should tie to something that we've talked about throughout the last couple of lectures. So we start off with the idea that psychology is empirical. We're trying to be scientific. We're trying to have sort of rules and guidelines, outlines for how we're going to do things. Psychology is theoretically diverse. We have lots of different perspectives, and each perspective brings its own unique point of view. So there are lots of different theories, and as I said, we might not know the actual right answer, but we can have lots of ideas on what might be happening. We need to keep in mind that psychology evolves in a socio-historical context. So when we look at where psychology has come, we didn't just talk about some of the ideas that they had. We talked a little bit about why those ideas came to be. So the fact that some of our perspectives only arose in direct fight against a different perspective, that's important. Or maybe that we were driven to start caring about cognition again because understanding how humans thought was really essential for the Second World War. So what is going on in the world when these things came into being is important to keep in mind. We also want to remember that behavior is shaped by our cultural heritage, like the example I just gave, and it's not just things like societal norms, there's so much more to it. And again, we'll talk about a bunch of those as time goes on. We want to keep in mind that behavior is influenced by both heredity and environment. So this is that idea of nature versus nurture. Is it that you behave a particular way because of your genes, or do you behave a particular way because that's how you were raised? And again, the real answer is somewhere in the middle. It's a little bit of genetics, it's a little bit of environment, And for the most part, what we find is that our genes give us sort of a range in which we'll operate. Maybe because of your genes, you're a little bit more extroverted than introverted. But our environment, the people that we've met, the interactions that we've had, will determine where we fall in that scale. We also want to keep in mind that people's experience of the world is highly subjective. Our past experiences, our current state of mind, the relationships that we're making with different things that we're viewing, all of that changes how we interpret information. So it's very difficult to have an absolute, especially when we're looking at things like behavior and mental processes and things like that. So we just want to keep in mind that people have these differing backgrounds, differing experiences, and it affects their behavior accordingly. All right, so that is it for the chapter. I am going to remind you one more time, Monday is a holiday, don't come in. We'll start chapter 2 on Wednesday, and you guys should have been able to find the chapter 1 quiz on Moodle, so you can start doing that whenever you would like. You don't have to submit it until you're ready to submit it, or it will auto-submit at the deadline. So lots of time to look at that. Enjoy your long weekend.